Hello, my name's Lorna Hallahan. I'm going to be talking with you this afternoon about advocates, how we select them, what might we look for, whom are we seeking? And this could also apply to people working in citizen advocacy offices, coordinators, and maybe members of boards as well. I'm going to a fairly dark place of human history in the last 100 years, but I think that we've got some stuff that we can take away that we can learn from this. So some starting points. First of all, to tell you a little bit more about me. I'm an associate professor in social work at Flinders University. I've been here for 16 years. I got involved in advocacy during the 1980s and was appointed to the staff of Queensland Advocacy Incorporated in 1998 as the foundation community worker. That meant that I had a job of travelling around Queensland and connecting nationally to help communities develop advocacy options within their local networks, and met some absolutely fabulous people, learned a lot of things, stayed there for 4 years and left at the beginning of 1993 when I moved to Adelaide, where I've now just been here for 30 years. And so, as I said, I'm in Adelaide. I want to acknowledge the country that I'm in. It's the sacred sovereign country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains and the coast. There's been an amazing restoration of language in this area. I was in a smoking ceremony of a new office earlier this week, and just seeing the confidence and the resurgence and the expression of culture was really very moving. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, but I also want to say that this is not just some sort of a ritual tick that we begin our presentations with. It really needs to become an ingrained practice, especially as we strive toward truth, voice and treaty. The things that have happened to Aboriginal people historically are shared with people with disability, and of course many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are themselves disabled, but the processes of the state to gather people up and confine them and limit their potential and destroy their lives were actually very similar. And so I think that we need to, those of us who are working in these sorts of areas, need to really be very, very clear that our starting point is always to start at country, to explore what it really, really means for us to be in country, but also to name the truth of what's happened here and continues to happen here. I also want to dedicate this session to a much, much loved friend, Jeremy Ward, who died last year. He was, at his funeral, people talked about him being a great teacher and a leader, and he definitely was that. He was one of the best. But he was the foundation lawyer at QAI, so in that 4 years I worked very closely with him, and I encountered him not only as a teacher but as a learner, as someone who was forever open to learn about the lives of people, the strivings of people, what it meant for people to be harmed and traumatised, excluded, oppressed, but also what it meant to find ways to reach in to setting people free in this way. And his openness to hearing about the lives of disabled people was the thing that really grounded his capacity as a teacher and a wise leader. He was a lawyer, as you know, an advocate. In the second part of his career, he was a writer, and he published 3 books, but the one that I would commend to you is called The Shouted Goodbye, and it tells the story of how his daughter Mina went on that journey of moving away from a tiny little institutionalised life that was on the plate of human services and into something much richer, and some glorious moments where they had to learn from Mina about what it was that she sought in her life. And it tells the effectiveness and the support of a circle of friends. So I encourage you to read it. He was a friend. And I could have talked with him about this presentation. It's the sort of thing that we maintain contact with over the years. And so for me, as I think about my sense of loss, I also think about a pattern of engaging with the world that he helped me develop, and I hope that I can carry forward, recognising his great contribution to my life and to the life of others. This, always like a bit of poetry. Those of you who've known me over the years know that poetry is an important part of my life, and I'm bringing to you a little bit of poetry from Seamus Heaney, who was the poet laureate for a number of years, an Irish poet who was thinking about the terrible communal conflicts in Ireland and the terrible loss of human life, but also the way in which those conflicts forced people into stifling who they were and the possibilities for forming genuine and supporting and loving bonds with each other. You may have heard this. Various world leaders have taken to reciting from it. When I first discovered it, that wasn't the case, but the story of the cure at Troy is based on Sophocles' play about Philoctetes, and here's a representation of Philoctetes, who suffered a terrible suppurating wound on his foot as they were embarking on the Trojan War, and was left behind. It didn't heal, it smelt, it was foul, and he was left behind by himself on an island where he lived for 10 years. And that's how long the war went on. And then various people decided that they needed his bow and arrow, and you can see it depicted here, to finish the war, and so they came back to get him. Now there's a whole lot of political understanding of all of that, but Heaney wants to see what it means to go to someone who has a terrible wound, who is in extreme isolation, and to re-establish a bond with that person. And so he sees it in that light, which I think is somewhat different from Sophocles. The work that I'm presenting to you today is based on an article which I published a number of years ago, and I called it "Believe that a further shore is reachable from here." I'm not going to read the whole thing, just a little. Human beings suffer, they torture one another, they get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted or endured. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave, but then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. This is the message that I want as I go into the resources that I bring to you today. I want us to believe that the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and that we can reach a further shore. And it might just be that one-on-one, patient, peaceful, loving, fearless attention that citizen advocacy can offer. Now I'm going to take you to the tricky, dark places. The first is, I was thinking about community and how corrupted it's become. And you'll feel my irritation as I go through this. And it's when hope and history do not rhyme is what we're going to look at first. And these are my bugbears. I'm not going to read all this. You can come back and have a look at the slides. But it's sentimental sludge aimed at enlisting my support for some pretty foul things. Australia is a community. And you would have heard this over the years as we peddled that lie as a way of turning away or indefinitely detaining asylum seekers and others. And it's the way of creating community by scapegoating outsiders. Those of you who've been in this world for a long time know that people with disability have been treated in the same way. It's deceit. Oh, the community is so wonderful. That is a community responsibility. McIntyre, who's written about this, says we need to be very careful that community, when we can recognise that community development's been a child of hard times. And this is one reason for its increasing popularity among governments as a way of handling increasing expectations in a time of limited resources. And we need only to look across the last 10 years in Australia to see that government steps out of resourcing and says do it on your own. And I think that the strongest communities are those communities where there are resources, where the redistributive power of government works to bring resources to communities that struggle with poverty and with internal conflict and all of that. There's a Garden of Eden myth. I used to hear a lot about this one, that, life was so wonderful. We didn't lock our doors. Children could play on the streets. There were no stalking threats to people, and everybody was jolly and happy. But if we really look at the time that people are referring to, we can see that there are incredibly high rates of institutionalisation, mainly of people with disability, imprisonment of Aboriginal people still going on, people who didn't submit to the reign of suburban life. And then looking forward, there's the heaven on earth myth, which is that we're all going to all of a sudden become a sort of multicultural fun fest, exuberantly celebrating difference as a source of enrichment. But at the same time, the shadow of that is the celebration of the emergence of technologies that are used to reduce what many see as the burden of the aged and disabled people among us, those who are fit, aspirational young workers. The next one is charity and condescension masquerading as compassion, care, mutuality, and demanding humility and gratitude. I think this is one that we need to be very careful that this shadow doesn't emerge in our advocacy work. I think it's always a possibility. If we don't position the question properly and engage with the right people, we can find this. And as someone who's lived with disability for coming up 50 years, I know what condescension looks like, and it's very cold. Marketing. We're in the Toyota community, the Microsoft community, the influencer community. And that's about building up groups of all too eager consumers of products usually made elsewhere by people who have no hope of ever owning the thing that they make. So when I go through this, why would I even bother thinking about the word community and why I'd use it? It's such a corrupted idea. And yet I know that from my work, from my own lived experience, from my reading of history in Australia, there has always been a community-based, family-based response to people with disability that says we will not hand our people over. And so I think that we are in that stream of history when we're thinking about citizen advocacy. It's always worth it to relentlessly pursue ways that people can become justly engaged in other people's lives. The choice is quite stark, really. I've gone back to Kenny Fry's, a guy from the US, in Staring Back, just for the summary effect of it. Throughout history, those with disabilities have been isolated in institutions, and I would say now in community settings, experimented upon, exterminated. We've been silenced by those who don't want to hear what we have to say. and this is really important for those of you who've come close to the lives of people with disability. We've also been silenced by our own fear. The fear that if we told our stories, people would say, "See, it isn't worth it. You would be better off dead." And it is precisely and simply and horribly difficultly because people with disability would not be better off dead that we remain dedicated in our efforts to resist exclusion and to strive for embrace. And so for this, I think that we can add some insights from those who have encouraged others to move beyond the claustrophobia of familiarity, and those who have sought to extend their sphere of relationships to foster the prospects of threatened others. And I think that's what citizen advocacy is. They've moved people involved in citizen advocacy out of this sense of a moral imperative, and maybe some other things, we'll see a bit more of that, move beyond the claustrophobia of familiarity and have sought to extend their sphere of relationships to foster the prospects of threatened others. That means that what we're dealing with here, and it's a really specific thing about the way in which we deal with advocacy in Australia, is that we are dealing with the relational aspects of human suffering. It's a wider understanding of suffering that takes us way beyond the body. And you know how it is, people always trying to drive back to diagnosis. Important, absolutely important, but not the whole story. And also in some ways beyond their immediate life conditions. We're talking about understanding suffering as relational. We acknowledge that in our actions we add dimensions of suffering to those rendered vulnerable by elements of their dependency. Everybody is dependent. We can go into that discussion, but impairment increases dependency. It's not a bad thing, it's just a reality. But it can become distorted, as you know. Simone Weil talked about it as affliction. She was French, affliction. It's not a medical term. It's not impairment specific or an old-fashioned way of talking about stigmatised persons. This is from an essay that she wrote. You'll see I've put a link here. You can get it in PDF. It's been translated into English, obviously. I don't read French that well. And it's an idea that comes to us, or a set of ideas, are struggling with present realities, as she was writing in 1942. She died in 1944. She was young. And she was blown apart by what was happening to Jewish and other people in Europe at this period, and the war itself. Affliction is an uprooting of life, a more or less attenuated equivalent of death, made irresistibly present to the soul by the attack or immediate apprehension of physical pain, and accompanied by the expectation or fear of social degradation. Isn't that what we see? Affliction induces a feeling of horror in which there was nothing to love and God seems totally absent. You don't need to have God in the picture if you don't want to, but it's that profound sense of abandonment that I'm sure that you have discovered among people as you get close with them. More insidiously, and this echoes Fry's thing, affliction induces self-contempt and even complicity in the awful situation. And we see how that happens in the relationship between disabled people and services, where people seek the very thing that will crimp and reduce their life. So this is, for those of you who are interested in Foucauldian understandings, what we're talking about is biopolitics, and I need to take you here because I want to have a look at the people who are involved as the righteous Gentiles or the rescuers of the Jews. I said I was going to a dark place, but that's where we're going to go. The important thing is that Foucault, looking about this sort of stuff, was talking about it as scientific racism or state racism. This is not some sort of relapse into barbarism when we see people with disability being maltreated, oppressed, excluded, exterminated. It's rather the use of all of the modern technologies. The use of the modern here is an interesting word, but anyway, contemporary methods, statistical methods, here's the population, in order to regulate the health of the population. The other side of that is that certain elements are excluded from the normal range of the population. These people are then defined as biologically dangerous. The service system in Australia has its feet deep in eugenics. Deep in eugenics. And I'm happy to discuss that with you later if you wish. My clock's donging 10. Didn't turn it off. Let it pass and then we'll move on. Ten seems to take forever, doesn't it? Killing the other, and this is this process of othering within a system of biopolitics, becomes acceptable if we can see that people are a threat to us, and that we are trying one by one to undo a history of state disableism, of a way in which we gathered up, regulated and continue to govern the lives of disabled people. In a normalising society, only these people are normal, everybody else is outside it. Race or racism is the precondition that makes killing acceptable. In our case, disableism, we're not so much talking about killing, but subjecting people to affliction, an apprehension. And we know from recent reports and the reports of the Royal Commission that many of the people that we are dealing with are experiencing direct physical abuse and neglect. So, whom do we seek? Here is this environment, here is this world that seems so difficult to have any impact. And so when I started to think about that a number of years ago, I thought, where have I seen people who didn't buy the dominant script that excluding, and in the case of the high point, the low point of Nazi Europe, exterminating. And so I started to have a look at the work of understanding who the righteous Gentiles were. You can find out about that. There's a lot of evidence that you can find just by doing simple Google searches. Now, it wasn't so easy a few years ago. The righteous Gentiles is a notion of coming out of Judaism, which is that there are people who display righteousness who are not Jews themselves, but they act in the righteous expectations that Judaism might call Jewish people into. So the question for me was, who says yes? And of course that's exactly what you're doing when you're recruiting advocates. You're asking a question. Will you stand with this person such that you can foster the prospects of their lives? And you want them to say yes. Well, some of them should say no. You don't necessarily want them around because they're not going to be helpful. But if you can locate those people who say yes, that's going to be important. So I asked myself, do we have any historical resources that show individuals stepping into the breach and forging powerful connection with people who are socially reviled? And of course, we know that. We've got that here. You are those people. There are also other people pursuing and enjoying creative, constructive, occasionally protective relationships with previously disparaged persons. Sometimes within organisations and sometimes within formal social networks. Looking at who enters those relationships and why can give us further insights into the processes that bind people to each other. And so the studies of righteous Gentiles, and I got a quote here from Jan Karski, who was a Polish man who is acknowledged as a righteous Gentile. The Jews were abandoned by governments, by church hierarchies, by existing social structures, but they were not abandoned by all of humanity. There were thousands upon thousands of people in Europe who risked their life for the Jews. They were priests, nuns, workers, peasants, enlightened ones, simpletons from all walks of life. They were good people, very simply. We have more good people than probably we think we have in humanity. And so, who are those good people? How do we know to find them? And I've looked at the work of Nakama Tech, and here's a link you can follow for her. She's still alive. She was born in 1931. She was born in Poland. She spent her childhood being integrated into a Polish Catholic family. She had a Christian name. She was baptized. And then at the end of the war, she would have been well into her teens, and by then she reclaimed her name, reclaimed her faith, and then has had a very interesting academic and social career, and she's done she started to think about who were the people who did this. She wrote a book called When Light Pierced the Darkness, and I've looked at the work that she's done in that. And this is Eva Fogelman. There's a link to her as well. I don't think she's got a survivor background herself, but she is someone who has spent a lot of time looking at research and working in this area. And so they're not the only people who've done it. There are others, but their social scientific methods have brought us some very interesting findings. So the analysis that Fogelman did of interviews with 300 rescuers, she called them rescuers, Tech calls them righteous Gentiles, and more than 150 people who were saved. She says you can categorise some of this quite quickly. Some rescuers were motivated by moral, ideological or professional reasons. This is the right thing to do. It's good to do it. The ideological stuff, when Tech had a look at it, she found that these people tended to be more what she calls leftist, but not exclusively. And professional reasons. There were social workers, there were healthcare workers, there were people who had religious vocations, various reasons like that. The other people that she found as a group were people who said, I like Jewish people, I don't have anything against them. They've been my neighbours, my dentist, my whatever, and I'm not going to, and I like them. And then there were children who'd helped in their family's rescue, and I assume there would have been other children around Nakama Tech as she was living with that family. Now the next bit is really interesting. The rescuer self took a quiet pride in their ability to maintain moral integrity, ideological beliefs, professional standards or humane relationships. And that's what they were looking at. Moral integrity, ideological beliefs, professional standards or humane relationships. I had to do this because if I didn't, my own integrity would have been compromised. And you'll see where some of this takes us. So this is the work of Tech. So who are those people? We've got a bit of a sense of what their motivations were. Tech says when she did her work and looked in the literature, there are many illustrations. She did a lot of casework stuff of help extended by the least likely individuals. This is a really interesting insight. So it was extended by the least likely and denied by those who we think might do it. Those who promised it or who, because of a special relationship or love of friendship, were expected to provide it. And so she said, what was it about those individuals that she could see? She said they had an internal locus of control and a view of competency. Internal locus of control, many of you will know what I'm talking about, but it basically says I steer my ship. But it has to go with being competent, a view of competency, a view that I can do something to influence the world. I am not powerless in this situation. She found when she looked at the sort of class profile and who they were, there were various things that she had to say about that. She found that there were, among the stories that she told, there were a number of intellectuals, people who maybe had the time to think through and to examine the society and all of that. There were middle-class people. There was a view that many peasant people were involved in this, and certainly many were, but she wants to say that of the families and people that she connected with, of middle-class people who had resources. And she says that most were politically inactive, but some had long-term involvement in leftist politics. A small minority of them were deeply religious. They weren't all Christians or Muslims, but they were people who were prepared to stand against. Remember, she's just looking in Poland against some of the Catholic Church pronouncements and the complicity of the many, but not all, parts of the Catholic Church. Going back to Jan Karski, he points out that many priests and nuns lost their lives doing this work. And she said friendship was not a primary motivation. So this is about reaching out to people who are not part of your friendship world, not part of your bonded, intimate space. So she arrived at a conclusion which I found really interesting, and it's about altruism and individuality. She described these people as autonomous altruists, and the unifying characteristics of them are that they express individuality or separateness. I might be part of the Catholic Church, but I do not follow the local bishop. I might be part of the profession of doctors, but I will not follow the processes that the government's setting out here. And so these are people that might not be connected to a whole lot of community organisations. They might actually be people who are holding themselves back from that. Independence and self-reliance to act in accordance with personal convictions regardless of how this is viewed by others. And that goes back to Fogelman's point about the preservation of a sense of integrity, that I can do something. Many of them had broad and long-lasting experience in standing up for people that she described as the helpless and the needy. And because of that, she thinks, they perceive aid in a matter-of-fact way. They're not heroic. This is just what I have to do. A lot of what they were doing was unpremeditated, unplanned beginning, sudden, even impulsive. Knock on the door, save me, yes, come in. But the other thing that she picked up, and I'll do a bit more on this in a moment, was that they all had a view that the Jews as a group, socially and culturally, were under extreme threat. They were helpless and dependent for protection. They couldn't save themselves from this. So these are autonomous altruists, and our question is, where do we find autonomous altruists who are not just going to fall into thinking about the sorts of solutions in the life of the person being the solutions which are offered by a dominant and domineering and dominating service system. Fogelman looked at what is the process that people went through. So we're at that point of asking a question. She says the formation of those people, and you can then see how this links to the work that Tech has done as well. they were brave enough to be aware. And I started off by talking about truth-telling, and that's what we are here. They were brave enough to be aware. They were not allowing their gaze to be deflected by all of those myths about how we're actually a kind community. They also interpreted the situation. Many people throughout Europe apparently thought, they'll stop. This is only temporary. It's not an ongoing persecution. But these people, probably seen by people around them as too negative, too gothic, said, no, this is going to play out to a ghastly end. And so they saw that, but they took responsibility for what they could do. They were neither fools nor suicidal, says Fogelman. They were not about to offer help unless they felt there was a good chance that they could be effective. And I think this is really important, and it goes back to the earlier stuff about an internal locus of control. I steer my own ship, but also that they have an understanding of competence. And I think that with competence comes resources as well. They had faith in their capacity to assess situations and find solutions. I'm a problem solver. There seldom was time for measured thought, only for quick assessments. And I think that links to Tech's work, which says that people had a long history of doing this. And in fact, when they started to look, there were people who'd been involved in this in the early 30s, being able to see the trend, the building up of that state racism and the biopolitics that was going to end up in whole-scale extermination. And it's those people who can make a quick assessment. Yes, I know what I've got. I know who I am. I know that I can do something here. Tech, this is my final slide about this, says it's about bringing people to a moment where they can choose their life's values. We live in a shaky and uncertain world. She's writing this in 1986. Things have not necessarily improved in the intervening almost 40 years. A world that offers little help in choosing life's values. In such a setting, knowledge and awareness about noble and self-sacrificing behaviours may help restore some shattered illusions. Indeed, mere awareness that in the midst of ultimate human degradation, some people who are willing to risk their lives for others denies the inevitable supremacy of evil. With this denial comes hope. And for us, I think I did a history project while I was at the Disability Royal Commission, and what I found, I referred to before, was that despite this long history of separating people, excluding them, confining them, limiting their lives, harming them, traumatizing them, inducing fear and a sense of powerlessness, that there was always in Australia, over the generations, individuals and families and small organisations that said, no, that will not be our way. And so since I've done this work that I've gone through with you today, I've actually had this opportunity to rediscover this in the Australian history. And so I want to be able to say to you that even when you see so many things that are persistent and difficult obstacles to a decent life and some freedom and self-love, some liberation and flourishing, that you can locate yourself with those in order to overcome that denial and to restore your hope. So the questions that I think are really interesting, we could talk a bit more about the Action T4 program, which was exterminating those people who were considered to have lives unfit for living. And the stuff that I've come across with this tells detailed accounts of nurses and doctors who were and church authorities and others who were complicit in the so-called euthanasia, but the killing program. And I can only, at this stage, I'll keep looking, come across non-identified references to families who removed their family member from an institution when they could see what was happening and concealed them. Families who refused to hand their family members over and concealed them. And some doctors who rewrote people's diagnoses in the institutional records and saved them from this fate. But the questions are also there for us about where do we encounter these individual altruists, these autonomous altruists, and where does it fit with weaving disabled people into community? What's the kind of community where we end up, where we want people to go? What are we building through this work? And we know that the righteous Gentiles ran incredible risks, and many of them paid for it with their lives. Those risks are not present here, to my knowledge, but we do need to understand what the risks are for the advocates, and that's the really important thing for the Citizen Advocacy Office and the organisation in itself to be able to support people. And the last slide is PowerPoint poisoning. Thank you. I look forward to discussing this with you.